All right, let's go ahead and get started. So let me tell you a little bit about what we are going to be talking about today. So native pollinators is our topic, and this is not going to be an exhaustive list of every single pollinator. You're not going to walk out of here knowing how to identify every tiny little bee and butterfly that you come across. We did a butterfly program a few weeks ago, and we could spend 3 days alone on moths and native bees, but we're just here to give you kind of an overview and to get you excited, especially those of you that have a garden at home and you're excited about your native plants or your backyard habitat. This is a chance for you to kind of get to know all the little critters that are hopefully coming to your yard or will be coming to your yard. And just to realize the diversity that's out there, the number of different species, thousands of different species that you can come in contact with, and that do this kind of like unheralded, fantastic job of helping to make our ecosystems run. You know, there's a great quote, and I think it's by E.O. Wilson, who's a wonderful evolutionary biologist. And I'm going to paraphrase because I can't remember it exactly. But basically, it's all these little critters that run the world. And it really is. It's all these little unseen animals that really make life possible. So we're going to introduce you to a few of them today and get to know their life habits and what they need. And we'll hopefully direct you to some resources where if you want to learn more about them, you absolutely can. All right, and we will be learning about a few native plants today. There we go. This computer's a little bit slow, so I apologize for those of you at home too if it seems like it's a little bit laggy. So just as a reintroduction for some of you who may have not been with us for a while or are new to Audubon, I'm at our Beechwood Farms location right now in Fox Chapel, and it's the headquarters of the Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania. Is there anybody here in the audience who's never been here before? Awesome, welcome, welcome. We're always excited to have new folks. We do have 3 properties altogether. Suckup Nature Park, which is up in Butler, PA, right near the Butler Airport. And my favorite, as anybody who has done these programs with me knows, is Todd Nature Reserve. And I was so excited. Our friend Carrie, who's online with us today, said they finally got out to Todd after hearing about it and got to see what a wonderful location it is. And we will actually have a plant that I saw at Todd in our presentation today. So here at Audubon, we do education and conservation. So programs like these, we work with school groups. You can see in the picture, this is one of our chimney swift towers on the left. So working to conserve our native chimney swift population. And as many of you know, our certified backyard habitat program, which we are very, very proud of, and very proud of all of you that are a part of it, and that we will be talking a bit more about later on in the program. So I welcome all of you to visit us at aswp.org to learn more about these programs and what we're doing. We update frequently. We also have a great Facebook page. So Audubon Society of Western Pennsylvania Facebook page. Please like, please follow. We're very proud of that. All right. So this Native Pollinators program is the last in a series on gardening with pollinators, monarchs and milkweed, and it's been provided to us, to you, free of charge through a really generous grant from the Pittsburgh Foundation. So hats off to the Pittsburgh Foundation for helping us all out. And I love this photo. I took this photo like 2 weeks ago. And if any of you needs a reason to plant ironweed in your yard, this is it. This is a fantastic native plant, beautiful, and would you look at all those little pollinators? I love that, especially that little skipper that's like zooming in for a landing, and you can see its little proboscis all curled up. It's like ready to go. We've got a little native bee right here, kind of dive bombing, ready to get going there. And it's just covered with all of these little skipper butterflies. So just an example of the abundance. And there's probably about, I think there are 2 or 3 species of butterflies, little skippers on this plant. So just an amazing plant that'll grow right in your yard. So let's talk a little bit just as a review about what pollination actually is. So we tend to think of flowering plants as putting out those flowers for our enjoyment because they're so beautiful, right? They smell nice. The colors are just, I mean, nothing says spring like a crabapple tree blooming. But those flowers are not for us. Those flowers are so that these plants can reproduce. They are critical to plants surviving in the wild. So how does a plant get from flower to fruit? How does pollination happen? Well, just as pollination 101, and this is real general. This is a close-up look of a wild geranium. So this is another native plant right here. And what we need to do with all of these flowers is get the pollen to the female portion of the plant, the reproductive, female reproductive portion of the plant. Now, this wild geranium, they're both located on the same flower, but the idea is for that plant not to fertilize itself. So this wild geranium, if we look at its parts here, you can see a close-up of the pollen grains, and they are located on the anther, and it's all held up by this little filament, and together they make the stamen. So that's the male portion of the flower, and then the female portion. So that's made up of the stigma, which is where the pollen is hopefully going to land, and travel all the way down to what you can't see, which is the ovary. And that whole arrangement is called the pistil. Now, this plant, those two parts are not active at the same time. This pistil will not accept pollen from its own plant because the pollen grains on this plant, the pistil will not open until those pollen grains are gone. So we're looking for these pollen grains to travel to a new flower. All right, so for the majority of plants, and when plants first evolved, the ability to transfer pollen, most of it traveled by wind or water. And any of you who have woken up on a nice spring morning to a car that is yellow because of pollen, you have an oak tree or one of these other trees nearby coating everything, the windowsills, those plants are releasing their pollen out into the wind. And it's a little bit of a crapshoot. So it's kind of like a message in a bottle. They make tons of pollen, send it out, and hope it lands on another oak tree. Not super efficient, but it does get the job done. And this is a picture of a spruce tree in the spring releasing just tons and tons of pollen. You're all feeling a little bit itchy right now, right? Your eyes are starting to water, your nose is starting. Right now, all of us who are kind of feeling like we may have a cold, you got the allergies upon us, that is ragweed pollen that is doing exactly the same thing. So you can see these trees really don't produce very showy flowers. With the coniferous plants, they're producing these male pollen cones right here that carry all the pollen. For that oak tree, you can see those flowers are not very showy because they don't have to attract the wind. The wind just comes. So now the message in the bottle idea, like I said, it's not very efficient, but if you produce enough pollen, it's going to work. So for those of you who are allergy sufferers, this is a trigger warning. This is going to be a little scary. This is a video of pollination by, I don't know if that's a bulldozer or what have you. And this is not the typical mode of pollination for most plants, but right? It's incredible. That is absolutely incredible. There's another really cool video. I didn't put it on here just because you can't embed it, but the Georgia Department of Natural Resources actually filmed one of their helicopters flying over a pine forest. And just the rotors of the helicopter just sending clouds of pollen everywhere. It's just absolutely unbelievable. So, message in the bottle, not very efficient. But somewhere around 100 million years ago, the plants started to say, what if we called FedEx? So what if instead of message in the bottle, we called UPS, the Postal Service, right? What if we directly sent our pollen where it needed to go? Great idea. Now, of course, evolution is not that driven by what the plant wants. You know, other factors are in play, but basically, this was the first pollen UPS driver. It's a beetle. And this beetle is 99 million years old. They found it preserved in amber, I believe in China. And they found it with the pollen grains from a cycad species of plant. They're a very primitive type of plant. So beetles were our first pollinators, and they still do a huge amount of pollination. Beetles were attracted to the plants because they ate the pollen, and they still do. But for most flowering plants, 85%, or actually 85% of plant species, having that FedEx driver, that UPS driver, is the preferred method of pollination. It's much more efficient. You produce less pollen. It gets transferred directly from an animal to, hopefully, to the plant species that it wants to go to. So this is your delivery driver. I should mention these awesome photos, some of these photos, especially of bees that you're going to see that are really, really close up, they're all available for free, and they are part of the U.S. Geological Services Wild Bee Lab. So I will have a link to that at the end, and I will send that to you as well. So you can see all of these beautiful photos close up. So animal pollination is so important. 1 out of 3 bites of food that we take is thanks to a pollinator, and most often bees, especially when we talk about our crop species. But probably roughly 35% of plant species or crop species are pollinated by insects. But even more important, or just as important, pollinators are key to our thriving ecosystems. So does anybody recognize these birds here? I know, Eileen knows. So cedar waxwings. And cedar waxwings are not pollinators. They are fruit eaters and insect eaters. But that fruit that this pair is passing between them, that's due to a pollinator. That, you know, often many of the trees that they're sitting in or making nests in are due to a pollinator. The pollinators may be directly serving as food for these cedar waxwings and their little babies when they go to build a nest and reproduce. So pollinators are absolute keys. They're keystones to thriving ecosystems. So with such an important process, you have to have a way to entice a pollinator to you if you're a flower. And flowers have evolved various strategies. So it all started out with pollen, but many plants evolved to produce nectar, not all. And nectar is a sweet energy reward that draws many pollinators in so that the pollen can then be distributed on their bodies. So this is a cutaway of some nectaries on a flower, and I can't remember which flower this is. And by coming in to get with many of our pollinators, coming in to get that nectar is kind of the plant's way of tricking them into carrying the pollen. Not all of them. Some of the pollinators actively come in for the pollen as well. All right, so who is a pollinator? Well, this is just an overview, and then we're going to talk a little bit about each one of these groups. So it ranges from mammals to birds, but mainly it's insects. So flies, butterflies and moths, beetles, which are by far the most numerous pollinators, bees, which are some of our most important pollinators, wasps, which aren't pictured here, hummingbirds, and bats. Now we're going to talk about all of these except for bats. And the reason we're not going to talk about bats is because our bats here in Western Pennsylvania are insectivores. They eat insects, they do not visit plants, and they are not pollinators. So if you go to the Southwest, the bats that you find down there, you'll find pollinators, but not here. So we're not going to talk about those. All right, flowers, in addition to having nectar, flowers may have evolved all kinds of little signals or signs to tell pollinators that they do have something available for them. So in this violet species, you can see the coloration near the center of the flower and those lines. Those lines are like little runway guides, and they lead a pollinator directly into where they're going to find the nectar. So these are called nectar guides, and many flowers, but not all, have them. The color of a flower may be important. So whether it's pink or purple or red, but oftentimes flowers have markings that we absolutely cannot see, but are extremely visible to pollinators. In fact, some of the most important signals to pollinators, especially when it comes to bees and hummingbirds and butterflies, may be something that we have never seen, a UV marking on a flower that's completely invisible to us. So this is just a picture that was taken of a buttercup with a UV filter on it, and you can see those markings all around the center of the flower that are completely, really pretty much invisible to us. And that's actually pretty common in the flower world. So we want to talk about biodiversity. Okay, so biodiversity is the variety of living things. And there are so many different pollinators, and each one of them we're going to see has a different life cycle, a different body structure, even a different way of flying. And flowers have evolved to attract and have relationships with different groups of pollinators. And so this is called pollinator syndromes. And that just means that some flowers are better suited to certain pollinators than others. And we'll take a look at this with each of our groups here. So it's kind of like a puzzle, you know, finding the right pollinator for the right flower. Now, we're not going to go over every single native plant here. We're not going to go over every single pollinator. But you guys in your yards and your plantings, one of the things you want to keep in mind is the more diversity you have in the types of flowers, when flowers are blooming, the heights of them, their structure, the more you're going to accommodate all of these different pollinators. So you don't have to know exactly the relationship between all of them, but you just have to know that diversity is important. All right, so we're going to start out with our, like one of my favorites, the hummingbirds. So hummingbirds are definitely important pollinators for some plant species. And here we've got our little ruby-throated hummingbird, and it is flying up to a native honeysuckle. So many of you, if you're in the CBH, I've said, yo, you want to plant this trumpet honeysuckle. And that's this plant right here. It's beautiful, and it is a native species. And we'll talk about why we want to plant natives towards the end of the program. But if you notice, the little, where the pollen is, okay, so that stamen right there, it's out towards the end, well past the end of that flower. So this little hummingbird, where do you think the nectar is in that flower? All the way up at the end, right? Now look at the length of the beak of that hummingbird. Is it as long as that flower? No. So it's going to have to shove its little face into that flower a little bit to reach the nectar. Now, it does have a very long tongue, so it doesn't have to go very far. But by getting its face close enough, it's going to get dusted with pollen from the tips of these little anthers here. And it'll get on the, you know, base of its beak, it'll get on its forehead there, and then because you've got a cluster of these trumpet honeysuckles planted nearby, it's going to go to another trumpet honeysuckle plant, and it'll eventually drop that pollen off at another plant. So it's actually a really, really cool design if you are trying to attract hummingbirds. Now, hummingbirds, their entire body plan is built to go after flowers. So this 4,000 per minute is how many times they flap their wings in a minute. That means in 1001, that hummingbird just flapped its wings 70 times. Maybe 80 if it's really trying to go fast. This is all to hover and feed on those flowers. The entire body plan of this hummingbird, all of its metabolism is geared towards going for these flowers. Hummingbird flowers, and we can see here just some other quick facts, their heart rate is 1,200 beats per minute. I mean, yours and mine, we're probably like 60 to 70, you know, on a good day. Maybe 120, 130 if we're really active. 250 breaths per minute. Their temperature, like most birds, is up above 104 degrees. So this bird is just built for hovering around flowers. So the flower types you can see, this is a perfect example, these flowers in this picture. Oftentimes they are red, but they don't have to be. And they're oftentimes tubular. So they have the nectar at the base of a very long tube that the hummingbird's tongue is going to go, insert in to get the nectar. This is a monarda, one of the monardas. This is bee balm. And the monardas are some of the best plants that you can plant. They bloom in midsummer, June and July, and they're fantastic for many pollinators and especially for hummingbirds.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
It might be a silly one. So are the flowers to the hummingbirds like food and the sugar water is like drinking?
So that's an excellent question. So what is the flower providing for the hummingbird? So the nectar is sugar water. It's giving and I should have mentioned that at the beginning, nectar is basically water and sugar, but it also has amino acids in it. It has some phytochemicals in it. So it's a little bit more than just sugar water. So the stuff that's coming out of a flower is more nutritious than what we're putting into our feeders, basically. But that is giving it energy. Now, could any one of us just survive on sugar alone? We need we need protein, we need nutrients. Hummingbirds actually do eat a fair amount of insects. So we'll see, we'll get to that slide in just a minute, but they eat quite a few insects as well. In fact, some researchers say that they're basically insectivores that also drink nectar. But the nectar is giving them the high levels of energy that they need to visit all of these flowers. And the thing about hummingbirds, now this monarda is a fantastic flower. It's in the mint family. It spreads really easily. It's going to give you loads and loads of nectar and lots of bloom time for these hummingbirds. But hummingbirds arrive here in April.
They what?
They arrive here in April. There are no monardas blooming anywhere in Pennsylvania in April. Not even our honeysuckles are blooming in April. So you need to have some food sources for them for those early blooming times. And this is where we recommend red buds. So this is a red bud tree blooming right here on the left. And these are very early bloomers in the spring. They are critical for hummingbirds. And this is a beautiful native azalea. This is a pinkster flower, pinkster bloom. And again, very early spring bloomer, really important for hummingbirds. Some hummingbirds are here so early that they actually will look for yellow-bellied sapsucker trees. So trees that the yellow-bellied sapsucker woodpecker has actually pecked into to get the sap, and the hummingbirds will drink from that sap. These hummingbirds arrive, they've traveled thousands of miles, they need a lot of energy. So you can help them out by providing these early blooming species. These hummingbirds will also be traveling through in September and beginning of October. So having a lot of fall blooming species that are going to be attractive to hummingbirds is really important too. And I already have my email ready to go with plant lists for all of you for hummingbirds and butterflies and native bees. So as soon as we're done here, I'll hit send and send it out to you. Now, this little hummingbird, we should also think not just about pollen and nectar, but we want to think about what else does a hummingbird need in its habitat. Because it's not just going to fly around all day making flowers or drinking nectar. The whole point of this hummingbird coming here is to nest, to raise its young. That's why it's traveling here from Central America. And this is a picture of a little teeny tiny hummingbird nest. And that is made out of lichens, so it's covered with lichens from a tree. And the bulk of it is held together by spider webs. So having native plants and having resources where spiders can find enough to eat and build their webs is important to hummingbirds. And having flowers and habitat for flies and beetles and other flying insects is crucial to hummingbirds because that's what they need. They feed themselves and their young. All right, so we're going to move on to the butterflies here. And again, like I said, we did a butterfly program a few weeks ago and we could spend a day just on butterflies, but they are important pollinators. Butterflies are like some of our other pollinators here. And I'm thinking mainly of Butterflies, moths, hummingbirds, wasps, a lot of our flies, when they visit a flower, they are going for nectar. They are not going for pollen. And picking up pollen on their bodies is kind of an accident for them. They're not meaning to do it, but they do. The pollen is sticky, it clings to their bodies, and they inadvertently take it to the next flower. But by doing so, they are actually pretty good pollinators. So we're going to look at a couple of the groups of butterflies, and especially some butterflies that you might be seeing right now. We're not going to spend too much time on them, but here we've got really, really common this year, and we're going to spend a little bit of time on these guys. Spice bush swallowtails, very common cabbage whites. These are the butterflies you see from spring until fall. This is actually an introduced species, and a lot of people think it's a moth, but it is indeed a butterfly, and you see them out in the fields and meadows quite a bit. This is one of our hair streaks, and this is another group of small, beautiful butterflies that, depending on the species, they're active at various times from spring until fall. Probably our largest group of butterflies include our brush-footed butterflies, which are fritillaries, monarchs, your admirals, many of the butterflies you're seeing outside right now, including this common buckeye, which is a really cool migrant butterfly. And then finally, we'll have a couple more pictures of our little friends, the skippers, which are just fantastic pollinators, flitting all over those flowers right now. So this is a really common butterfly on the left here. This is a pearl crescent. This is a little tiny orange butterfly that you're seeing everywhere right now. And it is on a perfect plant for a butterfly. So when we think about pollinator syndromes, butterfly flowers are either flat or they're clustered. They have clusters of flowers that are really easy for these long-legged butterflies to land on. They're typically brightly colored, usually red, yellow, or orange, and they produce a lot of nectar, and it's usually hidden down in like a tube. And that's where that butterfly or moth tongue comes in. So we saw in that first picture that tongue that was all curled up, that unfurls to reach the nectar down below. They do smell both through their antenna, they can pick up chemical cues, but also through their feet. Butterflies can taste and smell with their feet. So many of the flowers have faint, fresh smelling odors. They typically open during the day, or at least stay open during the day. And they have nectar guides oftentimes to show the butterflies where the nectar is. So here we've got, I think, a black-eyed Susan that this little pearl crescent is resting on. Typical butterfly flower. And this is from actually one of our certified backyard habitat yards. This is an example of a clustered group of flowers. This is bottle brush buckeye. It's a great big shrub, and it is beautiful. And I would say if you have room for a shrub in your yard, put this in. It basically is like the shrub version of our yellow buckeyes.
Is this out right now? Is this in bloom right now?
It's just past, it's kind of just past bloom. You know, there may be a few still blooming, and we're kind of at the end stage of it.
Along the road, you kind of see it sometimes? Is that one of those things?
This one you don't. So this is not, I don't see it in a lot of yards. It's not as common. You will see hydrangeas blooming right now. There are a lot of white hydrangeas that are blooming right now, so that could be what you're seeing. Oh gosh, Japanese knotweed is blooming. Yes, it is white. That's a good point, Eileen. And that is an invasive species that cuts down on all the diversity of native plants that we see. But this is really a great midsummer bloomer. It's a phenomenal plant. And I have to say, when I was at this house, there are 3 species of three tiger swallowtail butterflies on this plant. And this is a fraction. There had to be 30 or 40 butterflies on this shrub, mainly swallowtails, but a lot of smaller butterflies too, just covering it. They were going insane. So just an amazing shrub for butterflies and other pollinators. So the eastern tiger swallowtail is one of our largest butterflies. It's the large yellow and black butterfly. And as you head further south, the females can actually be all black. That's an adaptation that they have. They're actually mimicking another type of swallowtail that's kind of toxic tasting. But this butterfly will nectar out in the open, in fields and in gardens, but it needs tree species. That's where it lays its eggs. So butterflies have a neat relationship with plants because they help the plants by providing nectar as adults. But what do their caterpillars do? They eat the leaves, right? So plants must have this like love-hate relationship with butterflies and moths because they pollinate them as adults, but they eat them as young. And many butterflies have really specific needs as far as what kinds of plants their larvae will eat. Our most famous example that we had our program on a couple of weeks ago was the monarch butterfly. They only eat milkweed species. Tiger swallowtails are a little less picky. They will eat a variety of different tree species as caterpillars, but you do have to have those tree species around. So looking around your neighborhoods and seeing, do we have an oak tree? Do we have a cherry tree, in the neighborhood? And maybe think about planting those if you don't. Spicebush swallowtail, these guys have been everywhere. This has been a really good year, it seems, for spicebush swallowtails, and this is one of my favorite butterflies. Beautiful blue to blue-green markings and these kind of pale bluish-gray spots all along the margins of the wings. This is another woodland butterfly. It lays its eggs in the woods, specifically on spicebush. So spicebush is another native plant that we encourage you to plant. This is a little spicebush swallowtail caterpillar. It's so cute. It's got these fake eyes. It's like, I'm a snake, which it's not. But hopefully it fools somebody. And they have this really cool way of hiding during the day. So this is a spicebush leaf. And you see that shiny stuff, it's silk. So this little caterpillar, like all caterpillars, spins silk. And it runs it along the midrib, the midvein of the leaf. And the tension from that silk closes the leaf around the caterpillar. What? It's crazy. I'm blocking the camera. I'm sorry, those of you at home. I'm getting so excited about spicebush swallowtails. They also will have, I saw this the other day at somebody's property that I was visiting. They do have, swallowtails have two little, they almost look like antennae, but they're not antennae. They're little protuberances that they can shoot out. They're yellow and they're called osmetrium. So if they really get scared, they shoot those out and they give off this really gross smelling, tasting substance. They're just so cool. Now, when they're really little, they look like bird poop. So this is just, what more could you ask from an insect? I mean, how cool is that? But you got to have the spicebush. No dumb questions. Yes, so caterpillars turn into moths or butterfly, but lots of insects have larval forms that resemble caterpillars. So caterpillar is just the term that we give to the larva of butterflies and moths. But there are a lot of beetle larvae that resemble caterpillars, and it's the same idea. Many of these butterflies, like not as much with butterflies, but especially when you get to the moth species, some of the adults don't pollinate because they don't even eat. This is like the main stage of their life cycle. And the adult stage is just to reproduce. But these spicebush swallowtails, that's not the case. They go for nectar like you would not believe. So these, even though they may go into the woods to find the spicebush plants, they will come out into the meadows and into the gardens to feed. And you are seeing these all over the place right now. They're really, really abundant, it seems, this year. Really cool plant, or butterfly. Another one that we're just getting towards the end of their flight time. I think I saw one like a week or two ago, but they're just starting to wind down. And this is true with many insects and many butterflies. They only have specific times during spring, summer, or fall that they're out. Some of them are out the whole spring through fall, but some of them are only out for particular months or weeks. This is called a summer azure. And this is a tiny little butterfly. It's about the size of like my thumbnail. And beautiful blue on the top side, the dorsal side of its wings. And this one, it's such a striking little butterfly. And if you want it, you have to plant 9 bark shrubs or dogwood shrubs or wing stem, which is a beautiful fall blooming, it's blooming right now, big yellow composite flower, because that's what this butterfly lays its eggs on. Now, I am going to give you a link in your email, the larval hosts for all these different butterflies. So it comes from Penn State. They have a really great list of what you can plant that's a good larval host for these, but I will mention some of them. This is one that is, a lot of people would look at this and think is a moth. It's a tiny little brown butterfly. It's one of our skippers, and it's called a wild indigo dusky wing. And I just photographed this one 2 days ago out in our garden here. And they call it wild indigo dusky wing because guess which plants its larval host is? Yeah, the wild blue indigo or false indigo, the Baptisia, which we can see pictured here on the right. This is a beautiful native plant, great for pollinators, but it's also the larval host for this little butterfly here. And then we'll end with a few more skippers because you just can't get enough of skippers this time of year. So these are these little tiny, really fast butterflies that are all over your flowering plants right now. And there are a number of different species. And for those of you who are birders, identifying skippers is kind of like advanced sparrow identification. It can be really challenging. The males and females can look different. Plus, they're all like little orange and brown butterflies. So they can be a really big challenge. This little one right here is a fiery skipper. You can see from the little spots on its its wings there. And this is actually a late arrival. I believe it's a migrant in our area, so we tend to get them from the south towards the end of the summer. And then we have many of the Peck's skippers on these. And then I believe this is a little Zabulon skipper, which has the best name. So a really large variety of these little butterflies. They love these clusters of flowers. So you'll find them on milkweeds, you find them on ironweeds, you'll find them on the composite flowers like the sunflowers and the black-eyed Susans. They're super active, but they will sit still on a flower for you while they drink. Now, while all of these beautiful little butterflies are hovering around these flowers, Jaws is waiting underneath. I was photographing these butterflies and I found this lady hanging upside, like Dracula, right? So there's the head and the antenna, and there's those praying hands and the body. That's a praying mantis. And we tend to love our praying mantises, don't we? We do. Most of them are invasive species. They're not native species, and they will grab your butterflies. They've even been known to grab a hummingbird. So these guys are voracious predators. They do eat pests, but they eat all the good insects too. We do have a native mantis. It's called the Carolina mantis, and I've seen one, I think, in my days of looking at the flowers. There are also a lot of little native predators all over these plants, and that's normal. This is a little crab spider, and the crab spiders especially will be found up in the flowers, just waiting for all these little pollinators to come and they grab them. So they don't even build a web, they just sort of ambush them. I love crab spiders. They're so cool. So now we're going to move on to the moths, and the butterflies get all of the attention, including by me, but moths are actually probably more important. They're definitely more numerous. So we have about like maybe, I don't know, 105 species of butterflies here in Allegheny County. We have 850 species of moth, somewhere around there. So they are really numerous. And not all of them look like moths. So this little yellow colored scape, I believe is the name of this one. I can't quite remember it. Most people wouldn't even know that this is a moth. They visit many of the same flowers as butterflies. They have a similar body plan. Most moths hold their wings flat or out, whereas butterflies hold them back, usually over their body, folded back. And moths have these great feathery antennae, especially the males. Since many of them are nocturnal, they get a lot of their information through chemical signals. And so those antennae, the feathery surfaces of those antennae really help them to detect those signals. Oftentimes moth flowers will be tubular, pale colors, pale reds, purples, pinks, or whites, things that are going to show up at night, since many of them are nocturnal. Lots of nectar and strongly scented so that they can find them at night. And they do have to stay open at night. That's important. This is the coolest moth, and this is not my picture. And this is now my mission, is to find this moth. So this flower is a native primrose. This is evening primrose, right? And what do evening primroses do during the day? They close. This little moth sleeps inside of the closed flower. So it goes out drinking all night at the flowers. So it hangs out all night drinking nectar, and then it can't go home. It just falls asleep in the flower. It just falls asleep in the flower. Now, luckily, the end of its wings, you want to talk adaptation? Look at the end of its wings. It basically looks like a couple of droopy petals from this flower, right? That is so cool. I have to find this out there and photograph it. This is what the moth looks like when it's fully exposed. What? Is that not gorgeous? That is a beautiful moth. So this is the primrose moth, aptly named. And I mean, what a cool adaptation. It'll go to other flowers too, but it's hiding in this one. So evening primrose, which I'm not going to lie, has never been one of my favorite native plants, but it is now, because look at that. That is just amazing. Moths tend to have fuzzier bodies oftentimes than butterflies. You know, just another way that you can kind of tell them. But you see how it's holding its wings there, flat and down, whereas butterflies don't generally do that. Moths are just really weird. They're weird and they're cool. These are two other moths that I took pictures of recently. So this one, I was looking at the garden across the meadow here, and I noticed this one flower petal that looked a little odd. And that's because it was a moth. So this is called a goldenrod stowaway moth. And it basically camouflages as a flower during the day. And then this is one that many people see. It's not that uncommon, but they don't realize it's a moth. So this is the ailanthus moth. And if anybody recognizes ailanthus, that's the tree of heaven. It's a really invasive, non-native tree. The moth is native. It's native to the southern states, and it uses a different tree species down there, a native tree, and it's escaping me what it is. But it's adapted to use ailanthus as its larval host now. So that's why it's named after that plant. But this is just a gorgeous moth. And then some of our really important pollinators in the moth world are our sphinx moths and our hawk moths. And these include some of our favorite moths and some of our least favorite moths. Now, some of our favorite moths, like the Luna moth and the Cecropia moth and the other silkworm moths, those great big giant moths, they are not pollinators. They don't even feed as adults. Their main job is to mate. But these guys feed a lot, and they oftentimes feed during the day. So this one over here on the left, I get calls about this every year, about these weird little hummingbirds that are visiting my flowers, and I only get those calls from adults. I never get asked this by a kid, because any child will say, that has 6 legs, it is not a bird. Or the child will say, that has 2 antennae, birds don't have antennae. But adults always call about the baby hummingbirds that are at their flowers. So this is a moth. It's called the hummingbird sphinx moth, and it actually does mimic a hummingbird in its coloration. And you can see it has this real long proboscis tongue that bends, unlike a hummingbird's beak. And then its close relative, we actually have more of these here that I noticed than the hummingbird moth. This is the snowberry clearwing moth, and it mimics a bee. So very, very similar to the hummingbird moth. The coloration is a little bit different. And this is one of my favorite shrubs. Another one, this is buttonbush, and this is the flower for the buttonbush. It is so cool. So you can see all the pollen on the ends there, and the nectar is down in those little tubular flowers. So both of these hummingbirds, if you want them, plant native honeysuckles. They use native honeysuckles as their larval plant. They also have a few other plants that they'll use, but native honeysuckles are definitely a way to get these. Sphinx moth, this guy is a sphinx. Look at that, right? It looks like it should be hanging out with like Kylo Ren or Darth Maul on the Star Wars set. Like you can just hear it going. I mean, this is a Pandora's moth. It's another sphinx moth. And sphinx moths also have the coolest caterpillars around. So this is the Pandora sphinx moth caterpillar. And if you want this guy, you need to plant or save that Virginia creeper that you keep cutting away from all of your house and your trees and everything and that you hate, because that's what this lives on, grapevine and Virginia creeper. So I did say that these also have some of our most hated moths in this group. And how many of you have tomato plants? Okay, if you have tomato plants and you've ever seen the tobacco hornworm, the tobacco hornworm or the tomato hornworm, those are also sphinx moth caterpillars. So very cool caterpillars, but they can be pests as well. All right. Yeah, they can be pretty bad. They can be devastating. Now, the other cool thing about sphinx moth caterpillars though, and this is especially true of those tomato hornworms, is that there's another group of pollinators that parasitize them, wasps. And the wasps, and this is really common, we'll see this later in the slide, wasps use caterpillars oftentimes as food for their larvae. And the particular kind of wasp with tomato hornworms, they actually lay their eggs inside the caterpillar. And the little baby wasps eat the caterpillar as the caterpillar is still alive. That's very common for wasps. It is, and leave those caterpillars there, because what will happen is that you'll see these little white cocoons erupt all out of the moth. Don't touch them, leave them there, because those little wasps will then grow up to make more wasps, and they'll save your tomato plants. So wasps are our friends. All right, so let's move on to the beetles, and I'm gonna see if we can move this. I can never move this little thing. The beetles flowers are typically, beetles, like we said, 100 million years ago, they were our first pollinators. And there are more beetles than any other kind of insect on Earth. So just by sheer numbers, they still do a huge amount of pollination. So beetles tend to go towards flowers that are very primitive. Their parts are not complicated. All of their little organs, I mean, we're going to try and keep this G-rated, but all of their little sex organs are exposed. And so it's easy for them to get to the pollen because they don't have specialized mouth parts like a butterfly or a bee or a hummingbird. They have chewing mouth parts. So if the pollen is not right there, they're going to chew their way in to get it. So this one is, believe it or not, a native plant. This is swamp mallow. It's a hibiscus. We have it growing right out by the parking lot. And those are all little beetles inside of there. So it's really common to find beetles and flies in this flower. And the pollen, you can see the pollen just falls down onto the petals there. Bees will come and grab the pollen from this. So very simple, primitive flowers, typically white to dull green. They usually smell fruity or like rotting fruit to attract those beetles. Definitely open during the day. They do produce a little bit of nectar. Some beetles do drink nectar. And they will also go to clusters of smaller flowers, which you'll see here in a moment. I don't know why there we go. So this is a magnolia, and you can see the little beetles inside. I'm not sure of the species here, but you can see they're just going into the base of that flower, and they're getting the pollen. Spicebush is another one that beetles pollinate. Spicebush flowers very early in the spring. And then these are two beetles that you'll see right now. This is the Pennsylvania longhorn beetle over on the left, and the locust borer beetle, which is just a gorgeous beetle. And both of them kind of mimic bees in their coloration as protection. And this locust borer especially plant goldenrods. Goldenrods and asters are some of the best late season flowers you can plant for all of our pollinators, but especially for these beetles here. And that's going to bring us to the flies. Flies are important pollinators that many people don't realize are pollinators. And just like what you think would attract flies, flowers that are going for flies smell like rotten meat or garbage or dung, poop, and even blood. So they're attracting flies with things that will pull the flies in, because many of these flies will lay their eggs, not all of them, but many of them will lay their eggs in carrion. So this is our friend the skunk cabbage, very early bloomer. I mean, this flower will open at the end of February. And it mainly produces pollen, and that's plenty to attract. Many of the flies will go for pollen, as well as the nectar. A lot of the flowers will have like this funnel shape to them, or kind of little traps that the flies get stuck in. This is a very common, our green bottle fly. Many people are familiar with. This is a blowfly. And these flies are actually really important. They use them, you've ever heard of like the maggots that they use to treat wounds, like necrotic wounds? This is one of the flies that they get them from. They use them in, like if you're fans of CSI or any of those programs, they use their maggots in crime scene detection, you know, to see how long a body's been there or if it's been disturbed. But they are also disease carriers. They cause a lot of disease for stock animals especially, but they're important pollinators. This is a real common little fly. It's one of the hover flies, and these are a group of flies called the syrphid flies. Really, really common pollinators, and they mimic bees as well. And the way you can tell one of these little flies from a bee is, first of all, look at their antenna. Bees have really long antennae. Flies have tiny, tiny antennae. They have great big eyes that kind of meet in the middle, or almost meet in the middle, and they only have 2 wings. So most of their insects have 4 wings, including bees, and flies only have 2. Wasps are another group that often, you know, have the same warning coloration as bees. And wasps are actually pretty important pollinators, and they're pollinators that you are going to see a lot of right now. And when we think of wasps, we really think of hive wasps, so wasps that make a big hive, and we're all terrified because they're pretty aggressive and they sting. And these are 2 typical hive wasps. So a yellow jacket here, and this is one of the paper wasps. I think this is the metric paper wasp. So both of these have hives. They often use paper in their nest constructions, which they make out of wood. The yellow jackets tend to nest in the ground. So if you've ever been stung by ground bees, this is what you were stung by, a yellow jacket. Ground bees, actual ground bees and actual solitary wasps that nest in the ground are not aggressive at all. But these yellow jackets that have great big giant hives of, you know, hundreds and thousands of bees, they are very aggressive in protecting them. Paper wasps, they build those little paper nests where you can see the holes, so they're not covered by a big ball. Very, very common right now. We just had some volunteers stung by a group of them because they stumbled into the nest. So that's the thing, they're very aggressive in defending their nest, but I took this picture, I was actually on the ladder outside on the native clematis vine, and I was literally using my iPhone, so I was like this far away from these hornets and these wasps. They are not aggressive when they're feeding like that, and that's the same for bees. They are not aggressive when they're away from that hive. They are perfectly, they're out there looking for food. Now, this time of year, these bees do get a little crazy because all of these wasps, all of these workers that have been busy in the hive raising all the little baby wasps, their job is done now. And they're near the end of their life, so now they're just going out and drinking nectar. And that's what they're doing. Sometimes they do actually get drunk this time of year. They may get into fermented sap or nectar. And so there are more of them that you're seeing. You're not imagining things. And they just tend to be a little more crazy this time of year. But we do have a lot of solitary wasps that are really cool, that don't make a hive and are really not aggressive. So many of them nest in the ground, or they may make little specialized structures. And each female lays her own eggs. And then once she lays those eggs and provisions them, she's done and she leaves. So she's not defending it. She's not aggressive. She's not going to sting you. Stingers, as we'll see a little bit later on, stingers are the female's egg-laying organ. That's what it is. So only the female bees and wasps can sting, and most of them don't. So this one on the left, this is a red rusty spider wasp. And this little wasp is maybe an inch long, and these little ladies, when they lay their egg, they actually go out and find a wolf spider and sting it and paralyze it. And they wolf spiders are pretty big. They drag that wolf spider over the ground to their nest, and they stuff it in there, it's still alive, and then they seal it up. And that's what, when their egg hatches, that's what their larvae will eat. This little one over here on the right, this is a thread-waisted wasp, and they do the same thing with caterpillars. They sting a caterpillar, and they use it to provision their nest. Caterpillars and crickets and things like that. These guys have such a cool body plan. They have this really skinny abdomen. And sometimes, I couldn't get a picture of it, but you'll see them flying piggyback. The male will actually grab the female by the neck to mate, and they'll fly around like that. So it's pretty cool to see, because it's not a small wasp. They're about this big. Another solitary wasp, this one on the left is a potter or mason wasp. It's Untitled Hidalgo. And this one actually nests in the ground, but there are some potter wasps that actually make these little clay pots. So they actually gather soil and they mix it with water and they make these little pots, just like a little ceramicist. And they lay an egg inside of there, and then they take a beetle larva or something like that, sting it and stuff it in there, and it's really like, it's like Svengoolie. It's like that, you know, horror show on Saturday nights, you know, because their prey is all alive. It stays alive, and it basically gets eaten alive. But this one I took, this was made on a goldenrod flower, and they'll make them anywhere. If you've ever seen the pipe organ mud nests, those are made by one of these mason wasps or potter wasps. All right, and now we're going to go on to the bees. We're going to spend a little bit more time on the bees to wrap up here, because bees really are our most important pollinators. So all of these other insects, they either accidentally get pollen on them, or birds too, they accidentally get pollen on them when they're going for nectar, or they may eat the nectar or the pollen, but they're not actively carrying it away from the plant. Bees do. And that's because, you know, our little like horror monster friend, the wasp, that is feeding its larvae caterpillars and things. Bees are vegetarian. They feed their young nectar and pollen. So they are actively taking pollen, seeking out pollen and taking it to their young. So in carrying that pollen away, they have specialized structures and hairs on their body that help them to do that. And that makes it much, much more likely that they are going to transport pollen from one flower to another. So these are our star pollinators. The flowers that try to attract them are full of nectar. They are typically full of pollen, usually brightly colored, but they have all those markings that we can't see. They have nectar guides. Most of our bees are daytime active, so they're open during the day. They have a place for the bees to land or to hang on, and oftentimes they have those tubular flowers. Now, that being said, bees are incredibly diverse. Some of them have long tongues, some of them have short tongues, so you need to have a variety of different flowers available for them. So here's a picture of a honeybee, and you can see that this is a specialized structure on the hind leg that some bees have, and it's actually like an indentation surrounded by hairs. It's called a pollen basket. Honeybees do pack a lot of pollen into these pollen baskets, but they kind of like pack it in so hard and make it very like solid that it doesn't easily fall off onto other flowers. So that's not going to do a lot of pollinating. It's mainly pollen that's coming off of their bodies. All right, so here's a picture. This is actually a solitary bee, and this is not a native species, but it is one of our mason bees. And you can see these bees, they gather the pollen on the underside of their body. So they have these specialized seta or hairs under here that collect that pollen, and they're taking it back to these little larvae. And mason bees, each cell in their little nest, they lay one egg and then they pack it with pollen and nectar, seal it off with mud, and then do the same thing until they fill it up. So this is why bees are such efficient pollinators, because they need to take that pollen away from the flower. Because they're so efficient, some flowers actually really try to exclusively attract bees. So this is a really beautiful late blooming plant. It's starting to bloom right now. It's called bottle gentian, and this will bloom through September into October. And its flowers never open. They're always closed like that. And the idea, the nectar's down here, only bumblebees and a few of the digger bees are strong enough to muscle their way into that flower. So the flower is like closed to everybody else. It's a great strategy. And the bee knows that if it goes to that bottle gentian, chances are nobody's been there to get the nectar ahead of it. And the bottle gentian knows that the bee is going to preferentially go to another bottle gentian flower. So it's like a good trade-off. Now the problem is, it doesn't always work. So these are bottle gentian flowers that I took a photo of last year that a carpenter bee or a beetle was like, oh, isn't that cute? I'm just going to bite it off. So they'll either bite off the end of the petals, or some small beetles will actually just chew into the base of the flower to get the nectar. So sometimes it doesn't work. We did talk about stingers a little bit with the bees, so I'm not gonna go into that here, but you can see this is a yellow jacket, and again, these are the main stinging insects that you have to be mindful of. All right, so real quickly, we'll just talk about what makes a bee versus what makes a wasp, or how to tell them apart. Since these are the more aggressive of the two, it helps to know the difference. Wasps tend to have narrower waists, so that connection between the thorax and the abdomen. They tend to have longer legs. They don't have bent antennae like the bees, and they're not as fuzzy. Bees are just fuzzier. They're just fuzzier. They're the ones carrying pollen. Wasps, remember, they're carrying caterpillars, so they don't need pollen to stick to them. There are a number of other bee mimics that we've seen throughout the presentation, but the idea is that these other insects are using that similar warning coloration to tell predators, hey, I may sting you, so stay away. But the vast majority of them are harmless. Okay, so now with our wild bees, there are 20,000 species of wild bees. If we are talking North America alone, there are 4,000 species of wild bee in the United States. There are over 400 in Pennsylvania. And in your yard, there are probably 100 wild bees. We know not that much about them. And most people don't give them any thought. Most people don't even know they're there or that they are a bee. They're doing the bulk of pollination for all of our wild plants. And the reason we don't know much about them, this is a little sweat bee on a blue lobelia, beautiful little bee, metallic, it looks like a little jewel. The reason we ignore these guys is because of this, the honeybee. Honeybees are extremely important in our crop pollination, but they are not a native species. They were actually brought here, probably by European colonists. And so this is a Eurasian species. And it's a weirdo. one species that we're all familiar with that isn't even very much like all the other bees. So for first thing is, unlike most bees except for bumblebees, it produces honey and wax. And most bees do not produce either one of those. It's social, which is, again, unusual for most of the bees. They have a queen, they have workers and drones and a hierarchy. And even though some other native bees do have a hive with a social structure, only honeybees have this multi-year hive. Like a hive will survive for years and years and years. Most bees, only the queen survives over time. They're also the only bees to have a barbed stinger. So those workers that are guarding the hive, they have that barbed stinger that if you get it in you, if they sting you, you have to remove it. It gets stuck in there and the bee dies. But most other, the wasps don't have that. None of our other bee species have that. And these guys travel, or let's just say these ladies travel. Honeybees will go up to 2, sometimes 3 miles or more to find flowers. And they've evolved that like bee dance when they come back and they tell the rest of the hive how to go this great big long distance to get to those flowers. None of the other bees do that. In fact, most of our native bees, you need to think about the fact that they're only foraging for flowers within maybe a few hundred feet of their nest, and they will go no further. So you want to have nesting habitat for those bees. One of the neat things about these, if you look at their eyeballs, they actually have those little hairs coming out of their eyeballs. They have hairy eyeballs, which I think is just bizarre and a little creepy. But they use those to navigate those great big distances that they're traveling. And this bee is actually more like when you think of chickens or cows. It's kind of semi-domesticated. The vast majority of these honeybees are raised to go to agricultural crops. And 70% of our crops are, move that over, 70% of our crops rely on honeybee pollination to some degree. It's a $24 billion a year industry. But the thing is, there is colony collapse disorder, which is threatening these honeybee colonies. And this can be caused by anything from mites to viruses to bacteria to pesticides. It's sort of a complex of things that cause these honeybees to kind of collapse. So these beekeepers are bringing these hives all over the country to pollinate crops, but their colony may collapse if they don't really actively manage to keep them alive. Now the thing is, the honeybee is in no danger of disappearing, but the more often those beekeepers have to replace their hives, the more expensive it is for us, because that cost gets passed on to us, the consumer. And in many of these farm fields, native bees are already doing 25 to 35% of the pollination before these honeybees even get there. So native bees do billions of dollars in pollination for free. Now they can't do all of it, especially in modern farm fields, because they have these very specific ecosystem needs. So native bees, you're probably not going to find them in the middle of one of these modern farm fields that's just row crops. And you really, really have to have other flowers besides just the crops for them to feed on. They are excellent pollinators because, number one, many of them have very specific floral associations, so they may only go to particular types of flowering plants. And they're messy. So this is a little sweat bee. This is a Halictus ligatus. And you can see in this photo, it's just covered with pollen. They're a messy pollinator. And all that pollen is going to drop off onto a flower. And as I mentioned, some of these native bees are really specific to things like maybe they might only pollinate blueberry plants, or a specific time of year that they're active. Some of these bees, like our mason or orchard bees, mason bees are only active in the spring. So they can be pretty particular about when they're pollinating things. Another great thing about some of our native bees is they can do something called buzz pollination, and honeybees cannot do this. So buzz pollination is something that bumblebees and some of the sweat bees can do. And it's when flowers, certain flowers, have partially closed their anthers. So the only way to get the pollen out of them is to vibrate that stamen. And the bees do it with their wings, the frequency that's coming off of their beating wings. Not all the bees can do it, but bumblebees and these sweat bees can. Now, there's only a few flower species in the world that can only be pollinated this way. But they found that there are many species of plants that actually produce more fruit when they are buzz pollinated. So things like blueberries, tomatoes, potatoes, they do much better when they're buzz pollinated. So these native bees, like I mentioned, some of them are picky eaters. So when we're designing habitat, you want to have a diversity of those flower species. Sometimes it gets stuck. And as I mentioned, they might have a limited geographic range. So you want to have nesting habitat near where their food sources are. And they may only be active during certain times of the year and don't go long distances. So let's talk about nesting needs. With our solitary bees, 70% are ground nesters, like this little mining bee. So that's each female has a little tunnel or cavity in the ground, and that's where she lays her eggs. 25% of them are cavity nesters, like mason bees and leaf bees. And then a small percentage, kleptoparasites, that means they go and lay their eggs in other bees' nests. So these are the cuckoo bees and a few other species like wool carder bees. This is a very familiar bee, native bee species to many of us, the eastern carpenter bee. And if you have any wooden siding or decking, you probably have encountered this gigantic bee. And many people encounter it for the first time because it's hovering in front of their face in the spring. And it's just sort of like staring them down. It looks a lot like a bumblebee, except it has a shiny butt. So its abdomen right here doesn't have any fuzzy hairs on it. And that's one of the best ways to tell it's a carpenter bee. They are not aggressive, even though they get in your face. And this is a male. You can tell it's a male because he's got that white patch. They just don't see very well, and the males are very territorial. So they'll come over to see what you are. But the males can't sting at all. My cat loves to hunt for these on my porch, and I've had to rescue them. So I can't tell you how many carpenter bees I picked up in my hand, and they're just like, what just happened? And they sit there, they don't sting, I just let them go. They do a lot of damage if you have wooden structures. So that's one thing to consider. This is one of their nesting tunnels that's been cut open. So they typically make an entrance, and it's usually one female, but over the years you can get many females using one entrance and then making nests off of that. And then what they do is they make little chambers in those tunnels and seal them off with the wood sawdust. And they generally lay their eggs in July. And then in August, that's late August, that's when these little bees have hatched. They're coming out. The adults from last year are starting to die. So in August, you have carpenter bees everywhere. Then they overwinter as adults, and then they start the whole process again. If you don't want these, one of the best things you can do is paint or stain the wood real heavily because they don't like going through that. Bumblebees, which carpenter bees look like, bumblebees are one of our most numerous native bees, most common, I should say, that everybody knows. This one is a brown-belted bumblebee. There are actually a number of different species, and they're all different in their needs, their tongue length, what kinds of flowers they like, and when they're active. But bumblebees actually do make nests. They have little tiny hives. They usually only have about 50 individuals, and they actually do make a little bit of honey and wax. So they're kind of unique in the native bees. The other cool thing about bumblebees is they can be out really early in the spring. This is one of the first bees you're likely to see. They can actually warm up their bodies by shivering and beating their wing muscles. So they are very active. These are some of our early spring woodland wildflower pollinators. And if you want to support bumblebees, you want to keep your yard a little bit messy. Have some debris piles, little tufts of grass that may be left a little bit long, some patches of open ground. Doesn't have to be very big, just a little tiny patch, like flower pot size. of open ground that you don't disturb, you don't, you know, walk on, no pesticides and fertilizers. This is a little tiny, not that tiny, but this is a little tired bumblebee. This was a common eastern bumblebee that was sleeping in a Joe Pye weed flower head. So you will find them resting in the early morning. So we have a tired bumblebee and a perplexing bumblebee. That's actually its name. It's called the perplexing bumblebee or the confusing bumblebee. There are a number of small carpenter bees as well as the large carpenter bees. These are not closely related and they don't actually tunnel into your home. They actually tunnel into flower stems or plant stems, old plant stems. And this is a very small bee. This one is on a blue lobelia plant. I think this group of bees is really one of the most interesting. So these are one of the ground bees, group called the polyester or cellophane bees. And they actually line their nesting chamber with this polyester substance that reacts with their saliva to form cellophane. But it's a natural biodegradable cellophane that keeps their larvae weatherproofed in that little tunnel and just degrades down. So there's not like all these little bee plastic bags flying all over the place. So the really unique adaptation that they have. And then if you have a garden and you have cucumbers or pumpkins, you may be familiar with this group of bees, squash bees. So squash bees are fairly important to pumpkin cultivation here in Pennsylvania. And they've kind of moved north with the squash plants through the decades and centuries. So this bee, the female, nests in the ground near the squash plant. And in the morning, if you have squashes at home, you know they open in the morning, the flowers open in the morning. So the female is there. She's ready. She gets into that flower. She gets the pollen from that flower, provisions her nest with it. But when she gets to that flower, a lot of times there's a male squash bee. He has spent the night in the pollen, in the squash flowers, and he is ready and waiting. He's like Casanova, you know, ready to mate with her. But by the time the flowers close, by midday, the female goes back. She's busy in the nest, and the male goes to sleep. Sweat bees, these are some of our most common colorful little bees. They're all over the place right now, and there are many, many different species. Some of them look a little bit like very small honeybees, but many of them are these metallic colored Algochlora bees. And some of them, like this is a ligated furrow bee. These actually do make small hives. So many of them nest in the ground. Some of them nest in wood and cavities, but these guys actually do have kind of a social hive structure. They are called sweat bees because they are attracted to the sweat on your skin. They probably go for the salts. And this is a little metallic sweat bee on one of my favorite plants. This is one of our native orchid species. This is downy rattlesnake plantain. And it is, I took this picture in Todd Nature Reserve, and one of their main pollinators are these little tiny green sweat bees. Leafcutter bees, probably, I think we're wrapping up our bees here. This is one of my favorites. So they kind of have this weird, they almost look a little bit flat and broad on the back, and then they have this really fuzzy belly to carry pollen. And they nest in cavities, so not in the ground, but you know, we had a volunteer once that had them nesting in our garden hose. And they call them leaf cutters because they actually cut these beautiful little circles of leaves. This is a red bud. Oftentimes see them in red bud leaves. And they take those little leaf circles, and that's how they separate their eggs. So they stack up these leaves. It looks like a little bunch of Dixie cups stacked in a row. And you can see there's one she's provisioning. And they will use a similar structure to mason bees, but this is a larger bee, so they need a larger tube. And then speaking of mason bees, this is probably one of the most well-known besides bumblebees because they use them a lot in orchards and commercial pollination. This is a mason bee house, and they call them mason bees because the female will use one of those tubes and she'll lay about 10 to 15 eggs, and she uses mud to partition off those little tubes. Now, this is a non-native mason bee. This is actually an imported one, and this is the one they use in apple orchards oftentimes. Most of our apple trees have their origin in Asian species, so this little Asian orchard bee loves to pollinate apple trees. But we have a lot of native mason bees. So this one in particular, the blue orchard mason bee, is famous for its ability to pollinate. These bees, you have a little group of 250 mason bees, they can do the work of like 20,000 honeybees. They are so much more efficient at pollinating than honeybees. Each one of these females will make about 15 to 30 trips back and forth to get pollen. And every time she makes a trip, she may be visiting 15 flowers on that trip. So multiply that by 10 or 15 eggs. I mean, each of these females is visiting a tremendous number of flowers. All right. Oh, I should mention that these little mason bees, they overwinter as an adult. So they change into an adult within the tube, but then they don't emerge until the following spring. So when we think about our bees, some of the things that we can think about as we wrap up here, how do we help our native bees? This is a picture on the left of the rusty-patched bumblebee. And this was one of the most common bees here in the Northeast at one time. And now about 85%, they're gone from about 85% of their former range. We haven't seen one of these in Pennsylvania since 2006. So what happened? Well, like many other animals, loss of habitat, so loss of, nesting sites and flower fields is part of it. Pesticides is another big part of it, especially these neonicotinoid pesticides that affect bees quite a bit. But also, this one in particular, they think the use of bumblebees in greenhouses, so having captive bumblebees that you bring to greenhouses to pollinate things like blueberries and tomatoes with that buzz pollination, which is so awesome, they think that may have introduced diseases and parasites to some of the native wild bumblebee populations. We know about the rusty patched bumblebee, but we don't know about some of the others. We think the American bumblebee is in trouble. The golden northern bumblebee is another one that numbers seem to be declining. But the thing is we just don't know. There are not that many people researching bumblebees, and we don't have the data. We're just starting to collect that data. And that's where all of you can help, not only with your certified backyard habitat, but also by helping out with citizen science projects. So when we think about helping them, anything you do, and this is for native bees, but applies to all of our pollinators, plant one plant. Plant one native plant to start, and you'll be doing something. You don't have to think in huge scales to help these bees and butterflies. Your backyard can actually make a huge, huge difference. Use native plants. Native plants in the lists that I'm sending you are all native species. Native plants are species that have been here since before the European colonists came over. They've evolved with all of these pollinators, so they have relationships with them. They don't need pesticides. And that's important because you don't want to introduce more of the things that are causing our pollinators to decline in the first place. They don't need artificial fertilizers. They're adapted to our clay soils and our climate. And, like I said, they have relationships with these pollinators. Avoid pesticides if at all possible. I mean, if you have to use something, use it sparingly, but pesticides, for the most part, most of them don't discriminate, and they target all of our native pollinators. Neonicotinoid pesticides seem to be the worst for our native bees, but Any systemic pesticides can be problems for our native pollinators. And then provide nesting sites. So it may be providing a bee house like this. It may be just providing that little bare patch of dirt. It may be providing, by planting a variety of plants at different layers, you're providing sheltering and nesting sites for them. And having native plants in your yard, you are ticking off all of these boxes. You're ticking off food, you're ticking off shelter, nesting sites, all of them. You don't even have to know which particular pollinators you're helping. As long as you're planting that variety, you are helping them. This is again our little bee reminding us to leave that little patch of undisturbed soil. You'll notice there are no green grass stems around there. They don't do well in lawns. And these are, I'm just going to finish up here with some pictures from some of our certified backyard habitat backyards. So some of you may recognize your yard that I've been to. And some of these yards, I would like to point out, some of these yards, this is actually fairly new. This yard, they've only been working on it for like maybe a year or two. And this was all lawn before. So it doesn't take long. And you can see this yard, they have these little native violets that are blooming in the spring. They have a little pond that they put in with irises. This is cardinal flower. And they still have some herbs, you know, it doesn't have to be completely native species, but they have lots of little crevices and crannies for insects to hide. This, you can see one of the main things we like to do for pollinators, and I'm always telling the CBH people to do this, is plant in clumps. And that way, these butterflies, they don't have to go searching all over the place to find the next flower. The bees that are only visiting a certain type of flower on a particular trip, they don't have to go very far to find that next species of that flower. So plant them in clumps, have a variety. And then I love this one, and I think they're online right now. So this, like 2 years ago, as I understand it, was lawn. And now that's all native plants. You can see some grass growing here, left along. They have tree species that you can't see in the picture. All of this, and I can't tell you how many butterflies and bees I saw on that property. It was astounding. Here's another one of our certified backyard. This one is just down the road. And you can see lots of clumps of native species. This is a 9-bark shrub in the back, so that's providing nesting. It's providing layered habitat. You could have hummingbirds nesting in those trees behind there. So just having a variety of species. And you can see they have some ornamentals there, so it doesn't have to be all native. Those of you who are in our Certified Backyard Habitat program or a similar program, clap, 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 good job. If you're interested in it, you can go onto our website, but basically we'll come out, we'll visit your site, and we'll either tell you what you're doing right, or we'll give you recommendations and planting guides on how to improve your habitat for pollinators. So it's a really wonderful program, and I can't tell you how happy I have been going and visiting these yards, and especially when I look at the map and I see in Western Pennsylvania all the little pinpoints of habitat that are there now. And those pinpoints start to coalesce in neighborhoods. You know, I have been to Export in Murraysville a bunch of times. I've been down to West Mifflin and Baldwin, Whitehall, and out to, you know, the West End area, the North Hills, and you start to see these pockets of habitat that's so important to these pollinators. So you can also become involved in citizen science. And I really like this because I think it's a great way for you to connect with your backyard. And by doing citizen science, you gain a deeper appreciation. You look more closely and you notice more closely. And you're going to be providing data that scientists really need. So one of the simplest citizen science programs out there is iNaturalist. It's an app you can put on your phone, and most people use it because they want to identify what they're looking at. But if you upload your photos that you're taking, it actually becomes part of a database showing where species are located. And this is global. It's all over the world. The Great Sunflower Project is specifically geared towards pollinators. It's a very, very easy citizen science. I'll show you a screenshot of that. Bumblebee Watch, another one I'll show you a screenshot of, and Project Bee Watch, which is a local bee citizen science project that we'll tell you about. So Great Sunflower Project, this is a great one to do with schools or for you if you just want something simple. You basically pick a flower. It does not have to be a sunflower. It can be any flower in your backyard or plant, and you, for whatever set amount of time, you record the number of pollinator visits to that flower. And you only have to know, oh, is it a beetle? Is it a bee? Is it a wasp? You don't have to know the exact species, that's fine. They have a great set of bee identification cards on their website that I highly recommend. And I'll send you a link to that in your resources. Bumblebee Watch, which basically has you going out and taking pictures of bumblebees. It is harder than it sounds because bumblebees are fast, surprisingly fast, and they don't sit still. But you take a picture of your bumblebee, you upload it to their website, they will help you identify it. This is a screenshot of the app that you can put on your phone that will help you identify your bumblebee. But even if you can't identify your bumblebee, you upload it and they figure it out for you. So those two are really important, especially for taking a look at what is going on with those bumblebee populations. Project Bee Watch, this is a local one. This is being run by Matthew Updike, who is a professor at Point Park, I believe. And he has started collecting data on pollinators on 4 Allegheny County sites. And so they are at specific sites. You do have to contact him. And his contact information is up at the top here. But he is looking, I did ask him at the beginning of the summer if he's still looking for volunteers, and he said yes. And they've only been doing this project for, I think, 2 or 3 years. So, you know, they're just in the beginning stages of data collection, but they have training materials available, and it'll be a really cool way of contributing to a very, very hyper-local citizen science project. So again, and like I said, I have this in an email to send you. There are some great resources out there. The USGS Native Bee Inventory Lab is phenomenal, not only for photos, but also for the research that they are doing. So if you're interested in native bees especially, that's a great site to look at. Penn State Extension Service, their website has so much research being done on pollinators, on bees. They've been doing research on specific bee flower associations. They've even been doing research on cultivar plants versus the native plant and which are healthier. And they have some surprising findings there. You can't always tell. But they just have a fantastic website full of resources. So I highly recommend them. I have a couple of, especially if you're working with kids or an educator, those next 2 sites are really nice because they have basically flashcards that are like field guides for bees. And again, then that iNaturalist. I have additional resources that I'm emailing to all of you as soon as we end the program here. And with that, I would like to just say thank you all for coming out and spending some time learning about our native pollinators. I know it was a long program, thank you. And I would like to take some questions if anybody has them. And I know we have some questions on the chat. Oh, and actually Mary Beth, whose yard I said was lawn 2 years ago, she just verified. All those wildflowers, she said 2 years ago it was all lawn, so it can be done. And how deer resistant are swamp mallows is one of the questions. So swamp mallow was that really beautiful giant hibiscus that we planted. I am not sure if it's on our deer resistant list, which I'll send that to you all. But I will say that we have a ton of deer here at Beechwood, and I did not notice the swamp mallow being eaten at all. So it seemed to do pretty well. It does need, like its name, it does need moist soil. So you do have to have, you know, a nice, fairly moist soil for them. Then we have April says she planted a bunch of common wood asters And the pearl crescent butterfly I love showed up almost immediately. Absolutely. Pearl crescents are going to be, they're going to make your life so happy. Those little orange butterflies, they are all over the place, and they will just show up right away. If you plant it, they will come. All right. Do we have any questions in the audience here? Eileen.
I have a lot of big, tall, common milkweed, and some other kind of critter is eating it besides monarchs. A lot of fuzzy caterpillars.
Yes, yes, yes.
Black beetle.
Yes. So milkweeds have a reputation for, being toxic, right? It's astounding the number of animals that have gotten around that. So there are beetle species, and especially the milkweed beetle, the milkweed bug, which is it's the one you're seeing right now, the red and black bug. You're seeing their nymphs, their instars, young, all over milkweed pods. They actually pierce the pod and eat the seed. The milkweed beetles eat the leaves. The groundhogs, I have seen groundhogs eating milkweed leaves. And the orange and black fuzzy caterpillar is the milkweed tussock moth. It is a native caterpillar. And they lay, instead of like a monarch, which lays a single egg on the leaf, they'll lay a whole cluster of eggs. And then those little caterpillars all hatch out, and you'll go to bed one night and say, "Good night, milkweed." And then you'll wake up the next day and it's like a stem. They are voracious. Yeah, they are native. They are. Something like the Japanese beetle is not, definitely. But they've all evolved. And that's the thing about plants, our native plants and native insects. It's always like a little escalation of defenses and ways to get around those defenses. So that's normal. It's normal. It's normal to look up and see holes in your leaves at this time of year. So
last year I had planted and it grew really tall, the rudbeckia. Well, this year came back lobelia.
So you probably had some seeds there in the soil. So she mentioned that she had planted rudbeckia, probably Rudbeckia hirta, last year. And this year lobelia came up. And that does happen. Rudbeckias, the black-eyed Susan and brown-eyed Susan, are perennial, but they're not like a long-lived perennial. So they do depend a lot on setting seed. You may have gotten some lobelia seeds mixed in with the soil that came with the rudbeckia. So, that would be my guess. That's what happened. And, yeah.
Is Joe Pyeweed a native plant?
Is Joe Pyeweed a native plant? Yes, 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 yes. There are several species of Joe Pyeweed. I think there'll be 4 on your list. Many of them are gigantic. They get to be like 10 to 12 feet tall, and they're beautiful. But some of us don't have room for that in our yard. They're good to pair with some native grasses that are tall, that are going to kind of keep them upright and keep them from falling over. But they are native, and some of them are small. There's a trumpet weed, which is a Joe Pyeweed, which may only get to be 2 to 5 feet. So it can be pretty small. Some of them will actually grow in a fair amount of shade too. And Joe Pyeweed, ironweed, asters, and goldenrods are some of the best plants for late summer and fall that you can plant. They are like bonkers for pollinators. They will produce for you and for those pollinators, and they're beautiful. They're absolutely stunning plants.
The reason why I'm asking is because somebody's going to build a house. They took down the trees, but they haven't done anything with the land, and so the field has come up. There's Joe Pyeweed on the field, and I was wondering if I'm going to be able to rescue it. If I dig it out, is it going to do okay if I put it somewhere else?
So the question is, there's some Joe Pyeweed that is on a vacant lot right now, but it's going to be built on, and can you rescue it? I will double check with Roxanne with you for sure, but I think if you take it out in the fall, that you should be able, but I will double check with her about digging out the roots from that. And then I'll email that out to everybody, the answer to that. Eileen,
So with all these native plants that are setting seeds now, do you just let them sit there over the winter, or do you try to harvest them?
super question.
Other place, or what should you be doing?
Super question. So the native seeds that Eileen was asking, the plants that we have that are setting native seeds they're setting seeds right now. What do you do with them? You can just leave them. They're meant to be outside overwintered. They're meant to be out in the cold. So if you just leave them and let them do their thing, they'll reseed. If you want to collect them and preserve them and maybe take them to other locations and plant them, most of them do have to be overwintered in some way. Now that can be out in nature, it can be in your refrigerator. So there are techniques, it depends on the type of seed that you're collecting. Roxanne, I'm giving you advance warning. Roxanne, I hear through the grapevine, is planning a native seed collection workshop for this fall, where she will answer just such questions. That being said, if you look up the particular plant it is and overwintering strategies, there are a lot of resources online that will guide you to the best way to overwinter them artificially. There's also a fantastic book, I think it's, I can't remember the name of it, but the last name is DIRR, and it gives you all of those strategies for seed collection and native plants. But like I said, keep your eyes open for Roxanne's, and Roxanne is our Native Plant Center coordinator, so that's what she does, is she propagates our native plants and takes care of them. So that's a great question. Yes?
Basic question about the pollinators, and why are bees, why do we think that bees are so much better pollinators than, like, I'm just largely thinking
Sure.
beetles, and there's so many more beetles out there than there are bees, right? So why are bees?
That's a great question. So the question is, why do we consider bees to be the best pollinators? And why not something like beetles, when beetles are by far the most numerous insect out there? And you're right. So if you're so first of all, if you're a cardinal flower or a trumpet honeysuckle, your favorite pollinator may be a hummingbird. So it depends on the individual plant, but in general, bees are designed, because they're actively feeding pollen to their larvae, they are the one group of these pollinators that is actively going to a flower with the intent of getting that pollen and taking it somewhere else. And because bees, which I may not have mentioned this, many of these bees are very faithful to a particular species of flower, even if they go to many different kinds of flowers. On each foraging trip, they may only be going to a certain group of flowers, a certain species. So the chances are more likely that they might pollinate the correct species. Because they have structures on their body that are designed to carry that pollen, they're just able to carry way more. So a beetle is going to that same flower, and it's just going there to eat the pollen or drink the nectar. It doesn't have any intention of carrying it away for any other purpose. Its body doesn't have like those little hairs all over it or the special little pockets on its leg to carry pollen. And it may not be as faithful to one particular type of plant, although it may. So that, and if you look at like bees and wasps, that's what typically makes a bee a better pollinator than a wasp. I mean, wasps do pollinate, but their body is just designed to carry more pollen, and they're actively collecting that pollen. Whereas a wasp is like, I'm just here for the drinks. And then they're going to you know, feed their babies caterpillars. So does that make sense? Okay. And if you look at, the next time you look, and I encourage you, go sit there and watch these flowers and watch these little pollinators at work, especially these bees, but also the beetles, and watch how they move and watch how they go to each flower and how methodical they are. And it's really pretty amazing. And I mean, flowers have adopted strategies. If any of you were in the milkweed presentation, Milkweed plants are like, yeah, whatever. If you come to me, you are getting some pollen. They actually have that little like spring-loaded trap. It's pollen. It's like a pollen bear trap. And it closes on the legs of the butterflies or on the proboscis or antenna, whatever it grabs onto. And it, you know, it has to be carried away. So it's this really cool kind of like evolving and then co-evolving and like all of these relationships are really fascinating. It's like a big web. It's really fascinating.
What did you say were the, to get in the April for the hummingbirds? Red bud?
Oh yeah, so hummingbirds, you need to think early spring through October. So you need blooming plants for them all along the way. So redbud is an early blooming tree. Things like Virginia bluebells, you know, early blooming plants, but trees have so much more bang for your buck because you think of that one tree and all the blossoms on it. So crab apples, early blooming crab apples, cherries, redbud, buckeyes typically bloom pretty early. So yellow buckeye especially.
Did you say azalea?
Yes, pinkster bloom. Pinkster bloom is an azalea, native azalea. It's beautiful. I don't know why more people don't plant it. We have a question online. How long till monarch butterflies discover our milkweed plants? So our monarchs here took a while to come back this year. We didn't start seeing a lot of them until July, mid-July. And I know some places didn't get them until the end of July. If they're newly planted milkweed plants, sometimes you don't always attract that many or any monarchs the first year. Sometimes you end up having to be on a path that they're following. And you have to remember too, some of these, and they are doing studies actually, one of our participants and I were emailing about this yesterday, where they found that adult butterflies remember things that the caterpillars have experienced. Butterflies and moths to a certain degree. They're doing research on this. So if that's the case, I mean, we have vast stretches of our suburbs and cities where there has been no habitat for them for a very long time. So sometimes when we replace and put in new habitat, sometimes they come right away and sometimes it takes longer for them to find it. It's the same with birds. You know, people put up feeders and they're like, when are the birds coming? Sometimes it takes them a while to find them, definitely.
Can you say that thought again? That, what are you saying, the caterpillar?
They have done research recently that they are finding now they only did like one species, I think, but they're starting to do a lot more research with how much, because if you think of insects, they go through this big metamorphosis. So they change completely in body form from a larva to an adult. And they did research to determine if any of the memory of the experiences that happened to the caterpillar transfer to the adult. And I'm gonna have to go back and look through it. I'll look up a link, I'll put that in your resource list to the research. But they found that at least in this one species, it does seem to have passed on experience. And I want to say it was with the hornworm, but I'm not positive. Some of that experience of what, you know, maybe something tasted bad or, you know, predator, that does transfer onto the adult in some cases. So that's an interesting body of research. And, you know, so it may be, and if you think of monarch butterflies, the butterflies that are flying back to Mexico, the butterflies that you see in July will have never, ever seen North America before they come. They're born down in Texas and Louisiana. I mean, this will be their first trip. We never get return monarch butterflies here. We're always getting a generation that has never seen this landscape. So it's instinct, definitely. It's in their genes. But there is this new body of research, and I don't know that much about it, but it sounds pretty interesting. They go up into southern Canada, I believe. Yeah. So they go pretty far for a butterfly. Now, there is a species of dragonfly out in Asia that actually flies across the Pacific Ocean and goes further. But still, our monarchs are pretty incredible. All right. Well, I want to thank everybody once more and encourage everybody to get out there in your yards and enjoy all of the things that your native plants have to offer and bring you. So, thank you.